This is the Fashioning My Faith podcast for women, by women. I'm Erica Cantrell, and today we're going to talk about using my talents. And so, last time we talked about how we as women are more than just participation and the topics of traditional worship, not being able to lead. Well, that was a bridge to this episode to talk about the ways that we can do things that we can do outside of traditional worship. And so, I'm going to start out by telling you kind of why this is an important topic to me. And it's because whenever I first started doing one-on-one Bible studies with Miss Sherry Blackwell, we just started studying Women of Genesis. It was a Cindy Colley book, and I didn't have anything in mind that I was wanting to study. I just knew I needed more time studying to grow my relationship with God. And so, in studying the Women of Genesis, we kept learning about these women who were going off God's path, doing their own thing, and it would never really work out for them. And just studying and studying and studying these different things that would happen in these women's lives with or without God. And so I walked into Miss Sherry's house one day and I was just like, Miss Sherry, well, I don't know what I'm doing for God. Like, I need to do something for God with my talents. Like, I have God given talents. Every woman has God given talents. What am I doing with them? And I believe my exact words to her, because she asked me what I was thinking. I told her, I was like, well, maybe a podcast, hence this. And I remember telling her, I was like, well, I have a God given ability to talk and talk to a brick wall. And I'm just good at speaking with people. Like I'm just a talker. And so to me, doing a podcast is what I felt like my talents would be good using for God. And so we as women should ask ourselves that question all the time. Like, yes, I've started this podcast, but I have other things in my life that I'm working on now. And the question you have to keep asking yourself to keep those things going and keep using your talents is, what am I doing? What can I do for God? What am I doing now? And what can I do for God? And so we're going to look at two things. This one, depending on how our reading goes, may be a shorter episode, but we're going to break it down between Bible examples, and then we'll look at some modern day examples or ideas, maybe to help you brainstorm something you might could do for God and for church. And so our first example of just using your talents as a woman is going to be Dorcas. And if you'll turn with me to Acts chapter 9, verses 36, Acts chapter 9, 36, it says, At Joppa there was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and charitable deeds, which she did. And so we learn here that she used her talents to do charitable deeds, to do good works. She had time to do those extra few things in her life besides just the bare minimum. So her talent was going the extra mile, doing the extra deeds, doing the extra works. Our next example is going to be Aquila and Priscilla. Also in Acts, now in chapter 18, verse 26, says, So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. And so there was a Bible character who was preaching, and as he spoke in the synagogue, Aquila and Priscilla heard him. They took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And so he was making an error in what he was preaching. And so Aquila and Priscilla being the woman, so it wasn't just a man teaching a man, Priscilla being a woman helped her husband teach this preacher a more accurate way of God. And so as women, we can hold each other accountable, or with our husbands, maybe we are teachers. You know, I think it's important, as many times as my parents have told this story to me growing up or had heard it in church. My mom always emphasizes, she's like, it didn't just say Aquila went to teach. Priscilla went to teach with him. And so it was a husband and a wife. Wife was included. And so she used her talents by assisting her husband in teaching someone the way of God more accurately. We're also going to look at Lydia and the women at Philippi. Again in Acts, now in chapter 16, verses 13 through 14, it says, And on the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside where prayer was customarily made. And we sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Now a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira who worshipped God. the Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And so, two big things here is it says they sat down and spoke to the women who meet there. It was a place where prayer was customarily made, and women, plural, met there. And so there were several women getting together at this riverside to customarily have prayer together. And so, in and of itself, you have the women at Philippi who are doing that. And then, even further, you have Lydia who opened her heart. The Lord opened her heart so that she could heed the things spoken by Paul. And so, part of using our talents is just doing the little things, doing the prayers and doing the open heart, having an open heart. That is using your talent. If not everyone is good at having an open heart, but Lydia was one who was willing to have an open heart to hear and to be open to the truth. And so, as women, that's a talent we can use. We can open our hearts to the Bible and to the truth. Our next example is Lois and Eunice. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, it says, "When I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also." And so Timothy, being a man, was someone remembered a faith in him that was from the women, from his mother and his grandmother, gave credit for his faith as being taught, as being influenced by his mother and grandmother. And so as women, I'm not married, I don't have children yet, but I know from my mom and my grandmothers that my faith is made stronger by the influences in my life. Of course, that applies to fathers and grandfathers too. Like anyone in your life can have an influence over your faith, but as women, one of our talents is being able to influence others' faith. Our next example is going to be Phoebe. In Romans chapter 16, verses 1 through 2, it says, "I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea," and I could have just butchered that, "that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and assist her in whatever business she has need of you. For indeed she has been a helper of many, and of myself also." And so Phoebe, using her talent, was being a servant of the church. I know a woman at my hometown congregation back in McMinnville, and for a while, she cleaned the church building, and that was her using her talent. If we have a talent that we want to use, maybe it's cooking meals. If we have a talent, we can use that. We can be a servant of the church. And so that's what she did. She served the church and she helped other Christians. Where it says, "manner worthy of the saints," receive her and assist her in whatever business she has need of you. Helping others, helping the church. That is using your talent. Let's look at our last Bible example of women of Philippians. And so in Philippians chapter 4, verse 3, it says, "And I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life." And so there's several important components to this verse right here, but it says, "Help these women who labored with me in the gospel." These women labored in the gospel of Christ. Like they were actively working and laboring for this cause. And further at the end of the verse, it says, "whose names are in the book of life." And so as a side note to just using your talents, this is a verse which says women can have their names in the book of life. But back to the main focus, that was a talent of laboring, of persevering, of working. I'm not trying to venture too much into the next section of how to use and how to do some of these things in the Bible with our talents, but maybe it's something like our congregation that meets here in Cookeville, we just got into a new building, and several of us spent multiple hours, us women, painting the walls, doing trim. That's serving the church. That's laboring. That's using manual labor for the church. There's other ways to labor in the gospel. It may be reaching out and talking to people. We have a woman at church, and she used a fellow employee, someone she worked with, and she labored in the gospel by teaching her, and she was converted and baptized. And so there's multiple ways to use our talents to accomplish things like laboring in the gospel. And so now, let's relate some of these characters to modern examples and ideas. And so let's go all the way back to our list of examples. I'm going to go back through our list of examples, but instead of reading the scriptures and talking about what they did, I'm going to relate what they did to a modern example. So Dorcas, she was full of good works and deeds. Maybe today that's cooking, visiting, sending cards to shut ins, sick, or those grieving, going that extra mile, doing those extra deeds, those extra charities. That might be how we relate to Dorcas. Maybe Aquila and Priscilla with teaching and holding others accountable. Maybe we need to encourage and help our fellow Christians. If someone comes to us struggling, don't shame them. Help teach them, help guide them, help build them up in their faith. That's how we can be like Aquila and Priscilla. With Lydia, I have two examples for this one. Praying, worshiping, studying, and doing some of those things in private. Lydia and the women at Philippi, they met at a riverside, the women together. And so we don't need to just do everything in public for the viewpoint of others, but maybe even like me and Miss Sherry, and my mom comes to some of our Bible studies, our weekly Bible studies. We've started a new thing where we're doing them at local coffee shops. And when we talked about it, I was like, you never know who might walk in and see us studying out of our Bibles and have questions. And so doing some of those things in public may trigger some responses. But then also there, when we first started doing those Bible studies, we did them alone and we did them at Miss Sherry's house when I was needing to grow. Doing those things in private where we're not focusing as much on helping others, but just trying to build ourselves. And so there's benefits and pros and cons of just doing that extra studying, whether it be in private or in public. Another way to relate to Lydia with spending time in prayer and having an open heart is being open to being wrong. You know, we can be confident and we can be sure and we can be 20 years old and raised in the church, and I'm not confident that I'm always doing everything right. There is always a chance that I can be wrong, just as everybody can. There are people 50, 60, 70 years old who can be wrong. We can be raised in the church and be wrong, but we have to be open. We have to let the Lord open our heart to the possibility that we might be wrong sometimes, and let others teach us and let others hold us accountable. Just like we can hold others accountable, part of using our talents is keeping our hearts open to being wrong. Lois and Eunice, how they were influences. Be a biblical mother, sister, child. There's ways that my mother was an influence to me as I grew up, and then as I took on this role of doing a podcast, she said the words that she feels encouraged and influenced by me. And so being biblically faithful, finding ways to stick to the Bible as a child, as a sister, as a mother, as whatever relationship you have in your life, is using your talents, being a biblical girlfriend. Maybe you have a boyfriend that needs a little extra encouraging, or maybe you date someone outside of the church. You don't want to just go after those things. You should look for the right things, but as a biblical woman, try to use your talents as representing the Bible to build others up. Be an influence. Don't get influenced, be an influence. Moving on, maybe like Phoebe, she served the church and she helped other Christians. Ways we can serve the church. Maybe we can help plan VBS, plan ladies' days, help with the education curriculum. My mom is a school teacher. One way that she's been so beneficial in helping our church is helping with the education curriculum under the oversight of a deacon, but helping her and another woman work on the curriculum, make sure it flows, because they're teachers and that's a talent they have they can use for God. And lastly, the women of Philippians who labored in the gospel. Some ways we can labor in the gospel may be speaking at ladies' days, teaching other women, or teaching children's classes, teaching the lost, or even inviting others to church. Just getting people there is using a talent. Not everyone has a talent to just go out and invite. Some people are teachers, some people are reachers, they're bringers. And some people are there to help sustain the ones who are there so they don't feel overlooked. We focus a lot on getting people there and teaching people, But there are people who their talent is to keep people there, to keep people active and involved and encouraged. Because if you're a new convert and you get all this attention to get you to church and all this attention to get you baptized, how would you feel if all the help dropped off and then it's like, well, we got what we wanted and we're going to go on our way? Like, that's not very encouraging. And so, as women, one of the talents we can use is encouraging those who now just need to be sustained, need to be loved and kept at church, and not let them fall back on the back burner just because they've been baptized. And so, those are just a few ways that biblical examples that we can tie to modern day ideas, maybe just to help you brainstorm or just to think of a few things you can do. There's more to worshiping God and using your talents than traditional worship. And I know my mom, again, I said earlier, she's a school teacher. One of the ways as a public school teacher she chooses to use her talents is she said, I can't myself bring up the Bible in a public school setting, but she said, if a child sees the way I act as a biblical Christian woman and they have questions, then I can answer those questions. She can be that example. And so, just because we may not see it clearly, there are ways to work in what we do. Talk about church, talk about events going on. If you're not brave enough to just invite someone, maybe you're working on that area of your life, maybe just talk about it. Like, your coworkers are talking about how they're going to go to the beach or they're going to go to a restaurant. I get invited out on Wednesday nights a lot to go eat. And every time they invite me to eat, I say, thank you, but I'm going to go to church. I'm going to church. Like, I don't give up church for that, but a way I'm influencing and using my talent is just talking about it. It's just saying, I'm going to church. Doing this podcast is using a talent. Inviting to church is using a talent. Cooking is using a talent. When I was a kid in early high school, I found blank cards at Hobby Lobby, and I started hand making cards, like making little illustrations and sending those to the sick at church. That's using a talent. We just have to focus on what God gave us the ability to do. If you're artsy, make paintings. If you're artsy, make cards. If you're more quiet and reserved, do some of the little stuff like cooking that doesn't require the social interaction. If you're social, do some of the social interaction. There are ways that when we are in the church, we need to be in the church. We don't just need to be on the outside pews or the back pews of church. We need to be chasing our way up the aisle of church. Not literally, but figuratively. We need to have that motivation of, I'm just going to keep adding things for church so that when one drops off, I'm still doing stuff for God. I'm not falling behind. And I say all of that because at the end of the day, like in the beginning when we talked about what am I doing, what can I do, at the end of the day, that's the question we should ask ourselves every day. What am I doing for Christ? What am I doing for God? In what way am I, with my own talents, serving God? Because Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, that is the bare minimum. That's the expected. Praying, studying, extra time, extra conversations, extra actions, that is sacrifice. That is serving God. What am I doing for God? I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate your kind attention, and I hope that this inspires you to ask yourself that question every day. What am I doing for God?